Thank you for joining us for another edition of Against the Current, coming to you from atop the Old Republic building, the Skyline Club in downtown Chicago. Pleased to be joined by Steve Cortes for this edition. Steve Cortes, a bond trader by day, making America great by night,
That's right.
or by afternoon on the cable news channels. A Trump surrogate, also a member of President-elect Trump's Hispanic Advisory Council. Steve, thanks so much for being with us. It's great.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for having me. And, as an Hispanic, I appreciate a cigar, which I assume is from probably Dominican Republic.
I think it's a Dominican leaf.
Okay.
Yeah, your discerning taste, your Hispanic credentials, you're brandished properly. So why don't we just, before we talk all things Trump, why don't we wind back a little bit to how you became a Trump surrogate, how you became omnipresent on cable news channels for the past 4 months, as a lot of people will recognize. It's very interesting because it's very consistent with the Trump cabinet selections we've seen so far. Trump may not be so identified with the modern conservative movement, but you've been a part of the modern conservative movement for a long time with your kind of volunteer involvement in politics, this being another example of it. So you're a conservative. I know from previous conversations you backed Rick Perry 4 years ago when he ran. You were interested in Rick Perry initially when he was running in the 2016 cycle. Your kind of backstory of involvement in conservative politics that led you to Trump, that led you to this place.
Sure. No, it's, and I hope that it's instructive and illustrative of why Trump won, because I think I'm part of that phenomenon. I'm someone he won over. Rick Perry was a guy who grabbed me from just afar. I just admired what's going on in Texas as a Chicagoan. And by the way, this is one of the best rooms I think that I've been in Chicago.
Yes.
I love this city. Born and raised here, live here, raising a family in Chicago. Love this city, hate our government. Hate the things that are happening in our city regarding taxation, regulation, corruption, crime. When I look at Texas, I see the antithesis of almost all of that. So from afar, I really admired Rick Perry for a long time. When he decided to go national, I indicated, and I've been a consistent but small donor because I care so much about conservative causes, because I care about the Constitution and limited government and capitalism. So I'm known in some of those circles in a small way, but I immediately threw my hat in and said, I want to help Rick Perry any way I can. And so in 2012 became more involved than just writing checks and showing up at an event. Got on Rick Perry's National Finance Committee for a short time, albeit too short from my perspective.
Right.
He was the front runner. Came to our house.
If only he would have remembered the agency he's now going to be the secretary of.
Isn't it great? I love that irony.
Yeah.
Came to our home in Lincoln Park. We had a fundraiser, and I just frankly politically fell in love with the guy. I thought and still do, by the way, I think he's fantastic. And then come around 2016, obviously that didn't work out in 2012, but in 2016, he was certainly my initial candidate, and I joined him in, skepticism of Trump, and skepticism might be putting it mildly. Rick Perry referred to him as a cancer on conservatism. Yeah. I wasn't quite that caustic, but I was very critical of Donald Trump. I thought he was doing it for the wrong reasons. I thought he was doing it for publicity. I thought it was a bit of a stunt. I didn't believe he was a conservative. And I was won over, and I love to tell this story, and it's a quick one, but I think it's instructive. I was won over. I was on Fox News and really, really ripping on Donald Trump that night. I can't remember which show it was. I think it was Hannity. But really going after him, particularly for being a donor to Hillary Clinton, and saying, how can we as Republicans possibly trust this man?
I didn't know that was allowed to be said on Hannity's program.
Right. Well, yeah. I think it was Hannity's. But in any case, after that, had business dinner in New York, and then late that night was having coffee in a coffee shop not far from Fox News on 6th Avenue called Astro Coffee. Not that that's relevant, but regardless, I was there on 6th Avenue, and late at night, Trump was on, and he was on the West Coast, so it was coming on pretty late East Coast time, giving a speech. And no one was in there except for the staff, all of whom were Latino. And I'm an Hispanic, I'm a first-generation American, father from Colombia, care deeply about the issues that affect Latinos in America and immigrants generally. And these Latino workers, dishwashers, cooks, waiters in this restaurant were watching Donald Trump, and they were cheering for him and egging him on, watching the television in a way that really grabbed me. And I started talking to them and asking them, what do you see in him? And you know what they told me? They said, we see hope, and we see that he's telling the truth. And the way they said that he was telling the truth, it really grabbed me. And it convicted me, quite frankly, that perhaps I was being the kind of elitist that I then spent the next year and a half railing against
Yeah, right.
on cable TV, where I thought that just because he hasn't always been a conservative, or just because he says things inelegantly, just because he uses social media in a way that I'm not used to, I was almost prejudicial against him. And so I didn't immediately come around. It wasn't a Damascus Road experience where I immediately became a Trump follower. But what I did do is I stopped doubting him and I stopped criticizing him on air, and I started really listening to him. And once I was convinced that he was connecting, and my man Rick Perry was out of the race, once I was convinced that he really started connecting with American workers and with the forgotten American worker, he convinced me, he won me over. And so I did have a conversion experience, and I said so on Fox. And did my mea culpa on air and said I was sorry for the things that I had said about him and that I believed in him, with no self-interest, by the way. And they got in touch with me, the Trump people, and said, we want you on board. We're tired of you criticizing us, and we love that you've come around, and we certainly could use a Latino voice. And so I became a surrogate for the campaign and got deeply, deeply involved and dominated a lot of my life, frankly, in 2016.
Well, it was interesting because it seems like the Trump campaign surrogates, a bit of a ragtag bunch, a lot of names that people, even inside the bubble of political movers and shakers, hadn't heard of, didn't know.
Sure.
Many comms people I had never heard of. I mean, I knew you, and I knew a couple of the other people and some of the kind of the senior staff of Trump as the campaign came together, particularly after Kellyanne Conway assumed the helm. But it was just an interesting crew, and one of the kind of the fun things about it, even speaking as somebody who's got a background as a political operative, was the Trump campaign was a shot across the bow to all of the non-elite elites, as Victor Davis Hanson calls them, in all of these civic institutions, none of which are functioning as they should be, at least for those forgotten Americans you just mentioned, but also to the operative class, which is part of the political elite in D.C., that they're part of the non-elite elites, too, when it comes to the job they do, trying to manage campaigns and then translate campaigning into governance. So it was kind of interesting to see this group of individuals who hadn't been heard from, at least not with the ubiquity you were heard from during the cycle, rise with the Trump fortunes.
Right. No, and listen, and that's a great point, Dan. And I'll be the first to admit, so I have a long TV career, mostly in financial news.
Yeah, right.
Mostly with CNBC. So I certainly was not at all new to television. I was on the Fast Money halftime report every day at noon Eastern time for 5 years. So I was certainly well known in TV. But quite frankly, I had no political resume. I really had no credentials in that arena. I cared deeply about those issues, but that's just my own thing. So you're exactly right. To some degree, we were the island of misfit toys.
Yeah.
And because
it's a little bit of like a bad news bear story.
Right.
I mean, it really is.
It was a ragtag bunch, and because the traditional, the usual suspects, senators and governors, generally, particularly in the early days, were unwilling. Even if they happened to believe in Trump, they were unwilling to step forward and take that risk and allow somebody like me to achieve a prominence, which, quite frankly, I would not have achieved, say, if Jeb Bush were the nominee.
Well, right. And the other thing is, too, these kind of beltway establishment operative types that are more interested in sidling up to Chuck Todd. I think of Mike Murphy immediately comes to mind, and so many of these other hacks that have fleeced wealthy candidates to essentially get base Republican vote in states and, frankly, federal races around the country. Look at what Mike Murphy did for the Bush campaign.
Right.
He's just an example, but there are myriad others. And it's just to offer the vanilla establishment Republican line and do so in a way where we all guffaw around the round table with Clinton Foundation's donor zero on ABC, or Martha Raddatz, or Chuck Todd, or John Dickerson, and it's in the parameters of discussion between Republicans and Democrats are this far apart.
Right.
And so it was a bit refreshing to hear from well thought out voices like yourself to just kind of lay it straight. And also the thing I like about you, and wanted you to address this too, very different than many surrogates will do for a candidate at any level. You were willing to not defend the indefensible.
Sure.
When Donald Trump said or did things that were just unhelpful, saying things inartfully, going off on a tangent that was counterproductive. You're willing to say, look, that's not what I would have done. I wish he didn't do that. I know because you've said it on our morning answer program at AM 560. But getting back to where Trump really is and what his value proposition is and how he's directionally right, and then kind of reestablishing the case for Trump, that's so much a better way to address the audience on behalf of a candidate or an issue or an idea than just to pretend that I am representing perfection incarnate. Right.
Well, and listen,
and so that it's an interesting approach because not a lot of surrogates will take that approach.
Right. And thankfully too, and maybe I wouldn't have had that leeway again if say Jeb Bush was.
Yeah. Right. You've been clipped.
Maybe said, you know what, we don't need that. We need strict adherence. But unless I'm defending Jesus Christ, there is no man who walks the earth who deserves 100% defense. Right? Myself included, Donald Trump included, you included.
Right.
Very fallible individual. And by the way, a flawed candidate in many ways, and I'll be the first to admit that. I think his flaws almost became attributes, though, in some ways, paradoxically. The authenticity of Trump was, on the whole, an asset. At times, it was brutal. And at times, it was brutal to have to defend him. And you're right, I would not defend the indefensible. For example, I thought engaging with the cons was a massive mistake.
That's a good example.
Not just a bad political mistake, but just wrong, period. Okay, and I said so on air, and I didn't back away from that. But I will also say this, when I thought Trump was right, and when the mainstream media and when traditional Republicans, when establishment Republicans were attacking him, wow, was I an attack dog defending him, when I thought that was necessary as well. So I certainly was not milquetoast at all in my belief.
One of my favorite exchanges was you with the MSNBC anchor, and you got into a discussion of proper vernacular about illegal immigrants, and she wanted to call you undocumented, and you said, well, they're here illegally. I don't know, legal is legal and illegal is illegal. So it was nice to see pushback. So it wasn't like you were kowtowing to the PC apparatchiks on the cable news channels, but at the same time, when he crosses a line where it was so simple just to say, look, the Khan son, the son of the Mr. and Mrs. Khan, served our country honorably and heroically, and I respect and appreciate his service and the family's service by extension, period, full stop.
Right.
Back to what we need to talk about.
Let's get back to growth and security.
Yeah.
Amen. And you know what? Listen, mistakes were made, obviously. And to me, that was by far the worst mistake of the campaign. Thankfully, it wasn't a fatal mistake. To your point, too, Joy Reid on MSNBC
Joy Reid, that's what it was.
What you're referencing. And they continued to harangue me. And I sort of became, as the campaign went on, I was sort of the campaign's MSNBC guy. I was the voice of Trump on MSNBC, which is saying something, right? It's like being the Bud Light salesman in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. It's not the easiest job to sell your product. But I had a lot of fun with it, number one. But number two, it was important to keep them in check, because even though they went off the rails a bit, they would have gone off the rails every single show, I think, had I not been there to be at least some voice of sanity. And part of it is language. And I would say this all the time, that the English language matters, right? We can't speak in code.
What was the example you used back to Joy Reid on illegal immigrants about?
So it wanted me to call them undocumented.
Right.
And I said, undocumented makes it sound like the paperwork isn't in place. That's not the issue here. They don't belong here in the first place. They broke the rules. They cut the line. And by the way, cutting the line is most unfair to legal immigrants. All right, this isn't an issue necessarily for Mayflower white wasps who have been here for 10 generations. It's an issue to people like my father, who went through an arduous, expensive, time-consuming process to become a legal American. And I love legal immigration. And I think if you love immigration, actually you're doing it an enormous disservice than to cater to illegal immigration.
Right, having it be arbitrary and capricious, and then it's unpredictable, and then it's about currying favor with the government rather than everybody being held to the same standard, playing by the same rules.
I'm glad we won, and there's so many reasons I'm glad we won. I'm convinced, and this is a hypothetical, I can't prove it obviously, but I'm convinced that had Hillary Clinton won, she would have found a way to legalize the illegal immigrants who are here.
Sure.
I think it would have been executive order. I think she would have looked at 10 million plus almost automatic Democratic votes. And to me, that was a scary proposition. It was scary from a constitutional perspective, from a political perspective, and from an immigration proponent. Because you know what that then does is you set yourself up for a European-style reaction against all immigration, which we see in Europe. A place, particularly in Germany, for instance, that has let immigration just go nuts, right? And then what you end up with is no immigration at all.
Well, that's it, right? I mean, you can't. This is the thing. And by the way, what was the comparison you used with Joy Reid on the whole argument about language? And you're right about the importance of language. Emerson said, "First, the language is corrupted, then man is corrupted." What was the you compared it to calling a thief?
Yeah, a shoplifter. I said, is it an undocumented holder of a good?
Yeah, right.
Right.
Exactly.
You just didn't have your receipt, or did you steal it? No, you're a thief. Or if someone trespasses into my house, are they an undocumented, guest? I mean, no, they're a burglar.
Right.
Like, the language matters. If you come in the United States illegally, and believe me too, I have a heart for a lot of people who are in bad circumstances, particularly people who are brought here as children who had no choice. And I think that's an entirely different matter.
But here's the thing, and everyone agrees. There's no one who says convicted violent criminals that are here illegally should stay. No one says that. President Obama, this is a priority. It's everybody in power's priority. And yet, year after year, you have the ICE director appear before one of the Senate committees, and the discussion, mainly with Ted Cruz, is how many people that were convicted of Class X felonies are still in this country. And the number is tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands on an annual basis. So the problem when you don't run a system that you can enforce is I don't have any faith, and I'm unwilling to have a conversation about any other aspect of immigration, the legal regime governing immigration, because this one thing everybody agrees on, nothing gets done, nothing happens, and then you see the Kate Steinle and other people that are murdered or violently victimized by people who should have never been here, or people who were deported 5 and 6 times, and we can't even get that right. So now you want to talk about DACA and DAFA and path to citizenship. I'm willing to have that conversation when you prove to me you're serious about the thing everybody agrees on.
Right. And by the way, I think there's a lot of reasons that Donald Trump won, but if it's not number one, it's number 1 or 2. Is talking about immigration. Working class voters. Here's the thing. We live in Chicago.
Particularly the states that he won, that he flipped.
Correct. In the Midwest, particularly. We both live in Chicago. I live down the street from the mayor, who lives under 24-hour police protection provided by our tax dollars. And then he pontificates about sanctuary cities and acts as though he's being bold and he's being moral. It's the opposite of moral, because you know what? He doesn't have to deal with the on-the-ground consequences of that. You know who does primarily? Latinos, number one, all right? People with names like Cortes, people with names like Moreno and Ramirez, and cops on the beat.
Well, and African Americans.
Of course.
And the south and west sides, who are 80% of the murder victims.
Right. So they have to deal with the real world consequences. And by the way, it's one of the reasons, there's a lot of things I'm proud of at this election. And I mentioned that we were a ragtag bunch, and we were, in some ways, idle lost toys, but we figured it out and we won. The Bad News Bears did win this election, and we're going to occupy the most powerful office in the world, sort of collectively via Donald Trump. But one thing I will say that we did is we gave voice to people who believed that they were powerless, and they believed that not without reason. The elites of this country, both Republicans and Democrats, have created a system financially and politically that rewards them at the expense of the rest of the country. And I think people said, Donald Trump, I don't love everything he says. I don't love some of the inartful, inelegant things he says. But you know what I do love is the fact, and it's ironic, this Manhattan billionaire was the one who was able to put his finger on the pulse and say, I understand what you're going through, and I have a way forward. It's not just, I understand your pain. That's too Bill Clinton-esque. It's not just I feel your pain. I feel your pain, and here's the way out. And one of the ways out is political correctness is not just dumb, it can be deadly. It can be deadly in national security terms when we're talking about terrorism, and it's terrible economic policy.
It's a lie. That's what political correctness is. I mean, I don't even like that term, because what it is, it's a lie. Yeah. That's what political correctness is. It's lying. And people, I think, to your point, the deplorables, were tired of being lied to and thought to be too stupid to know that they were being lied to.
Yeah. Well, and that might have been the moment, by the way. I think that the left was convinced that the Billy Bush tape was the moment that we would lose the election.
Right.
And by the way, it was terrible. I won't hedge on that at all. But I think they thought that was the moment they won the election. I think, in fact, the moment they lost the election was the deplorables comment, if we can narrow it down to just one moment. She was in Manhattan at Cipriani at a restaurant that most Americans couldn't afford one meal to attend. She was speaking to an LGBTQ crowd, which, by the way, and I don't mean, I'm not trying to disparage them, but I'm just saying in terms of not speaking to real America, to working class America, thought that she could speak in a way to a crowd that she's very comfortable with, right? And that she could consign working class America to a status that is, in a condescending manner, that they are rubes. And I think Americans had it. They had it economically and they had it culturally. They were tired of being, in America, unfortunately, the Democratic Party and parts of the Republican Party have basically told you that if you're a working class person, if you love high school football on Friday night, if you go to church on Sunday, if you maybe hunt in the fall on Saturday, we're not very interested in your opinion. You don't matter a whole lot. What we care about is the Acela corridor.
Yeah,
we care about Georgetown and Brooklyn and Brentwood on the way other side of the country, and that stuff we fly over in between, not all that relevant to our lives. And there was a rebellion at the ballot box.
Yeah, everybody voted their shares. And it turns out the deplorables have more shares when they're activated. And I tell you, I mean, and it cuts across all of the demographics, race and age, not as much as we would hope as conservatives. But I mean, certainly if you watched all those shows you were on and all those cable news channels, and of course the old media networks and their affiliates, there is not a single college-educated woman and there's not a single Latino in this country who voted for Trump. Now, the fact is, 45% of college-educated women voted for Trump. I mean, it's just stunning because to listen to it, not a single one, not a single college-educated woman anywhere voted for this guy. And he, he lost that demographic, but narrowly. And then Latinos, of course, he outperformed Mr. Clean, Mitt Romney, from 4 years ago.
No, and I am so enthused about the future because the Latino population in America is here, it's growing, it's a treasure to this country. Armageddon was predicted regarding Latinos for this election. I was in New York, very honored to be there on election day, the week leading up. I did countless news shows, mainly CNN and MSNBC, and it was ubiquitous on air that we were going to get destroyed among Latinos. And the drumbeat was so consistent that I almost started to believe it, quite honestly, a little bit. I mean, of course, I didn't in my heart, but I certainly doubt, right? Like, gosh, is this going to lose it for us? And then, listen, my candidate made some really unfortunate comments regarding Latinos. He did. Now, I believe his policies are going to be incredibly rewarding for Latinos and produce growth and security for our community. But we had an uphill battle, partly of his own doing, partly because of an incredibly antagonistic media. But the reality is, guess what? On election day, not only did we beat Mitt Romney, we outperformed expectations massively. By our own internal polling, we were polling in the teens. Our internal polling at Team Trump among Latinos, we ended up with 29%. And by the way, that's based on exit polling. I think we probably did better than that. And I think a lot of the evidence shows that if you look at the actual precinct by precinct returns, I think a lot of the Latinos leaving the ballot box were not necessarily willing to tell a complete stranger, I just voted for Donald Trump, but 29% were. And why? Why did we do well against this candidate who supposedly hates Mexicans, right? Who supposedly believes Mexicans are murderers and rapists? That's not true, by the way.
That's not what he said, right?
But that was the narrative. That was just constant. That was ongoing, almost on a 24-hour reel. I believe a couple of reasons. I think number one, school choice. He spoke to school choice immediately and forcefully, more so than any presidential candidate that I've heard, certainly. I think that speaks to Latinos. And I will tell you and this is anecdotal, it's not a stat, but I know so many Hispanic families here in Chicago who are trapped in our failing CPS public school system. They would love to send their children to private schools, primarily their parishes, primarily Catholic schools, and it's not a financial option for them. I think it resonated when he spoke so forcefully about that he wants to be a liberator of these neighborhoods. And then I think the other thing that resonated a lot with Hispanics is just economic growth. This has been a wonderful economy if you have already made it. If you could afford great cigars and fine drinks, It's been a wonderful decade. It really has. If you own a lot of stocks, a lot of real estate, you're doing great. Most Americans, the average American, has not had a pay raise in this century,
Right.
since the year 2000. And it's worse than that for people of color. African American men, since the end of the recession, so I'm not even penalizing the recession sort of on President Obama, since the end of the recession, their net income down 9%. Hispanics overall down about 4%, while white income is roughly unchanged since the end of the recession. So people of color are falling behind more and more. Slow growth always penalizes the middle and lower classes the most, right? They're the ones, we have more businesses closing than opening in America for the first time on record. Hispanics are twice as entrepreneurial as the rest of the society. So business formation is critical to Hispanics. So I think on the ground, they felt that. I think school choice spoke to them. And because of those two issues, economic growth and school choice, I think they came out. And listen, I don't want to hold a parade for 29% of the vote.
Well, I was going to say, I don't want to fall into the trap of the other side of overstating the case either. 29% of the vote, what was the African-American percentage of the vote?
I think 8 or 9.
9%. That is, as you say, this is not the time to celebrate and say, look, we did so well.
Right.
I mean, those are frankly scary numbers, horrific numbers. It still is a representation of how much inertia is behind Latinos and African Americans voting for the Democrats,
Sure.
right? Even perhaps the most fatally flawed Democrat presidential candidate in the history of our country. I mean,
Right.
just an awful candidate. It's one of the reasons she lost. I mean,
Right.
who you run against matters. So Trump was the beneficiary of being able to run against Hillary Clinton in a change election. So it still speaks to an unbelievable amount of work that needs to be done, clearly, for us to really compete for the Latino
Right.
vote and the black vote, because 3 out of 10, 1 out of 10, we're not going to win races on volume
Right.
in those demographics. So we need to cut into the distribution.
Right. No, listen, agreed 100%. And that's what I'm saying. I don't know. I'm not saying hold parades. But I am saying, but let's recognize how much we outperformed expectations.
Yeah.
That's important.
Yeah.
And it's important in context of history. And where can the trajectory go from here? I believe, and listen, here, so the good news is we outperformed. The bad news is the onus is on us. We have the White House,
Right.
we have the Senate, we have the House. In state legislatures, we are absolutely romping, right? Under President Obama,
2/3.
we picked up almost 1,000 state legislature seats. I believe half of the states now have complete control, governor and both houses, versus I think it's only 6 on the Democratic side. So this is time to deliver. We have to deliver. If we deliver on school choice, if we deliver on economic growth, I believe that we'll also reap the electoral benefits from here. And one thing I would add too that's interesting regarding Hispanics, because it hasn't gotten any play, because of course mainstream media just won't pick up on these things. And I wish there were public polls. There's not that I know of, but according to our internal data, we actually won Hispanic evangelicals, and that's the first time that has happened. And we won them primarily on life issues. So the idea too that you can't run as a pro-life, socially conservative candidate, I think is a fallacy. And I think I believe Donald Trump just proved that, whether it's white evangelicals or it's Hispanics. So I think there's a blueprint for how we proceed from here. But agreed, listen, we have work to do. This is an uphill battle, right?
Yeah, and I mean, even among evangelicals across the board, I mean, remember what Tony Perkins from Family Research Council said after that Billy Bush tape came out, and some people shed Trump. He did not, because he said in response to that, my support of Trump was never about shared values, right? It was about, I think that he is more likely to protect our religious liberties than the choice before us. We're not always going to have those choices be as stark as they were, to the extent that you even argued those choices on those issues were stark, but at least Trump put down a marker on those issues, and you knew what Hillary Clinton represented for the past 30 years. But to your point about delivering, now you have to deliver on the substance of them. You can't just be less worse than the other option, right? And that's really across the board, including on economic issues. And so, as you mentioned before, somebody who has been a contributor to CNBC and a financial services professional, there's been a lot of good economic news since Trump was elected. I mean, U.S. Steel talking about 10,000 new jobs, and IBM talking about 50,000 new jobs, and Ford Motor Company, the much pilloried Ford Motor Company by Trump during the during the campaign about their desire to move a plant to Mexico. That's not happening now. They pull back and they're going to create 700 new jobs in America. So there's a lot of corporate America, very much like politicians. The bad news is they're cowards, and the good news is they're cowards.
Right.
And so they're trying to, signal a note of optimism and hope and collaboration with the new administration, and that's good and that's great in the short term. But in the medium term, how much concern do you have as a free marketeer with some of what Trump has said and continues to say about trade policy and about his mercantilist tendencies with respect to kind of picking which companies are going to get what benefits to stay versus others that will not?
Yeah. No, and Dan, this would, quite frankly, as we mentioned, before, this would be a place where I'm not 100% on board with my I always keep saying candidate. He's no longer a candidate.
Right.
He's the president-elect. Tariffs worry me, scares me. I think it needs to be on the table. I think it needs to be on the table the same way when you're talking national security, sort of nukes need to be on the table. We shouldn't ever use them, but it's part of our arsenal, and it's part of getting people to do what we need them to do to achieve peace. I know that's an extreme example, but I do think it's similar. Like, we don't want tariffs. Tariffs ultimately become a tax on the consumer, and I'm a free trader. But I think it's important to acknowledge this. We don't have free trade right now. We just don't. And our trade deals, particularly with China, are incredibly one-sided, meaning there's almost no reciprocity. They're nowhere near as open to our products as we are to them. And
I think that country is pronounced China.
Yes,
now.
China.
Yeah, it's just point of order. Right.
Yeah. His pronunciation, I thought, was a hoot throughout. He had a problem with a lot of H's. When he would talk about Huma Abedin, he would Uma, right? Huge.
Brokaw had similar problems, and he was
Hey, he's the president. He's 70 years
old. Nightly news for
what are we going to do? Send him a hook on phonics?
No, not at this point. No.
But no, listen. I think it needs to be out there as a threat. I don't mind him using the bully pulpit. I don't. I think that's a good idea. But here's the more important long-term solution. The near-term solution has been, and I think it's important to show. I'll say this. I think it's important symbolically to show Americans some wins. And he hasn't even taken the field, and he's scoring touchdowns, right? He saved 1,000 jobs at Carrier. He got Ford Motor to not invest $1.5 billion in Mexico, but instead half that amount they can put into a plant in Michigan. Michigan over Mexico. It's a win. It makes people feel better. That's important too. And when I say feel, I mean, maybe I shouldn't say feel. It makes them believe. And the economy is as much about belief and confidence and optimism as it is about policy. So I think we need both, and I think that's important. But long term, there's carrot and stick. That's the stick, right? Of we're going to make it hard for you to go elsewhere. I'm much more focused on the carrot of we don't want you to leave, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of in a relationship, in a marriage, right? It's not so much that, well, if you go on a date with another, I'm going to divorce you. Much more like, why would you want to? I love you. I'm gorgeous. I'm here for you.
Quid pro quos, you want an environment that.
Right. So let's create that, and I believe we will. But again, I think it's important for him. What he's doing, I think, is messaging to his supporters, particularly blue-collar workers who feel they've been utterly forgotten. And by the way, they have been. They don't just feel that. It's the reality. By the elites of America. He's signaling to them, I have your back. But what's more important long-term, because let's face it, while it's wonderful that he saved 1,000 jobs at Carrier, and I love that 1,000 families in Indianapolis didn't face Christmas with a layoff, wonderful thing. That's not great economic policy, and in the scheme of our country, it's not significant. 1,000 jobs. What is significant?
And frankly, you don't want to see that policy scaled.
Right. Correct. Because inevitably that leads to cronyism, and we've had far too much of that already. Where I think we're going, though, I think that those are symbolic gestures. Where I think we're going, and I hope and believe we're going, is if we simplify our tax code, if we reduce taxation generally and broadly, and if we reduce the regulatory, just absolute albatross that is upon American business, primarily small business, by the way. Big business is pretty good at dealing with regulation, often crafts it.
Yeah, right.
Small business suffers the most. If we relieve those burdens, and I believe we will, we're going to see America flourish. There is, I really, when I look at the American economy, and put my partisan hat aside, as a Wall Street guy, as a trader, I think there is so much pent-up creativity, capital, know-how. we are dying to sprint, but it's a sprinter who's wearing a weighted vest. We take that weighted vest off, and thank goodness too, we're in an enviable position because the rest of the world is in shambles. I mean, Europe is a disaster. China, which was supposedly going to take over the world, right, is maybe worse than Europe in a lot of ways. So it's time for America to shine, I think, economically in a way that it has not probably since the 1950s. We can do it with the right policy prescriptions, and I believe that's going to happen. And I'm way more focused on the carrot end of how do we make our environment right for business at all levels. Giant companies like U.S. Steel and General Motors and Ford, tiny mom and pop enterprises. How do we make it possible for them to thrive?
So here's Newt Gingrich said just within the last few days, his concern is that Trump and the administration writ large runs into the morass that is D.C. and loses some of its heart.
Sure.
Right. It kind of gets bogged down in the molasses of policymaking inside the Beltway, and I think that's a real concern because Trump is demonstrated he is not averse to going off on petulant tangents. I mean, there was a story out just within the last few days about him throwing a guest of Charles Koch out of his club in West Palm Beach because the guest was somebody who had written an unflattering biography about Trump. Now, that actually doesn't bother me that much. I think it's kind of fun, and it's interesting that he knows the guest list at his club with all of the other things on his plate. But I mean, what's encouraging is the cabinet nominations that he has put forward because there's a lot of serious people. Like serious thinkers and doers, and people have a record of serious doing across the board, and people that are drawing unbelievable ire from the left, which is always a good sign.
Sure.
So that's encouraging, but from your perspective of being on the inner circle and getting a sense of a lot of these folks, including the family, which seems to be very important, do you think that there is any concern that Trump will go whichever way the winds of popularity are blowing and not take all the slings and arrows that are going to be required to be taken in order to do some of those things you just said?
Yeah, Dan, I can say unequivocally doesn't worry me for one nanosecond. And I'll tell you this, and listen, as you know, even in this conversation, I want to admit what I think are his flaws, both during the campaign and even now. The tariff talk scares me, as an example. Not completely on board with him there. When it comes to his resoluteness, though, oh my gosh, I have no worries. I think this is a guy who would gladly be, if necessary, a one-term president and do exactly what he thinks is right. He doesn't need this, right? He lived an amazing life already. He wants it for the right reasons. I firmly believe that. And I don't know him well, but I did get to know him a bit over the course of the campaign. I think he is almost impervious to caring what the elites think about him. I think it was, and again, I think working class Americans saw that. It was part of the paradox of how does this Manhattan billionaire connect so closely with a coal miner in eastern Ohio? But
you think he's impervious to that? Because it seems to me, I mean, doing like armchair psychoanalysis, it seems to me he's somebody that needs constant affirmation. And when he doesn't get it, he gives it to himself. Sure. I mean, this is like the Norman Vincent Peale taken to the nth degree, who was kind of a philosophical North Star for Donald Trump, and it's always positive, and if the affirmation isn't coming from somewhere and he's not giving enough of it to himself, then you just worry that maybe he starts to crumble.
No, you make an important point there, but I believe there, it certainly has happened, I think, during the campaign, and I think it will happen during his presidency, and you're right, that is a fair analysis, that he does seem to need that affirmation. But again, not from elites. I think he wants that affirmation in a rally in Paducah, Kentucky. And by the way, I hope he continues doing those rallies for that reason. I think it's so critical. I'll give you an example from the campaign that I saw on the inside. One of the coolest things about working, maybe the coolest thing about working on the campaign, and when I say working, I was a volunteer, but part of the campaign, was, and I didn't go to a lot of rallies because they always wanted me on television, so it didn't make sense for me to be with him physically, but when he would come backstage, I can't tell you the almost pep rally that there was every time with law enforcement, with cops. they adored him, and he adored them. And it was really, I mean, in the purest sense, I mean, it was almost like an incredible athlete meeting the adoring fans, and the picture taking, and the rah-rah, the high fives. So I think that's where he gets his energy. I get what you're saying, and I don't disagree. I think he does need that affirmation. But I don't think that affirmation needs to come from the salons of Georgetown.
Yeah.
And I don't think it needs to come from the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I think he's perfectly fine getting that, from, as I mentioned, Paducah, Kentucky. And I think that they'll stay with him. So there are legitimate worries. There's always worries about an outsider, right? Legitimate worries. There were tons of worries about Ronald Reagan, by the way.
getting co-opted.
Right, who wasn't even nearly the outsider that Trump is.
Right.
At least he was a politician, but still an outsider. A lot of worries about him as a cowboy, as a renegade. Much of that being replayed now in mainstream media about Trump. And those worries are not without some foundation. I'll be the first to admit that. But I will tell you this, my read of him, and again, I don't know him well, but my read of him from knowing him in the campaign and from just observing, as you and everybody does, as an outsider is, if he needs affirmation, it's not the affirmation of the elites, and certainly not the DC elites.
Wow.
I think he might almost invite the opposite.
Well, I hope that's true, and I hope that that carries through his term or terms, however it works out. And I mean, to your point, if that's what feeds him to be stout of heart, then when that moment comes, like it came with the air traffic controllers for Reagan, I mean, there will be that watershed moment for him. I don't know where it will happen. Maybe it's with the Supreme Court nominee. Maybe it's with structural tax reform. But there's going to be a moment where the world is against him and everybody's going to call his bluff, and that will define his first term, and it'll just be fascinating to see. You mentioned at the outset, you're a resident of Chicago, as am I. Donald Trump has made overtures throughout the campaign and since his election to his commitment to essentially provide air support for urban centers that are in decay. Chicago would be at the top of that list, and he even recently tweeted to Tiny Dancer here that 20-year high in violent crime, 800 murders, 4,300 shootings, you should ask for federal help rather than thumbing your nose at the federal government with your restatement of your sanctuary city policy. That's my parenthetical statement. But what about that? And have you had discussions about what federal help on the law enforcement side or the prosecutorial side for a city that is beset by by violence like Chicago, what that would look like or should look like?
Right. I don't know is the honest answer on the law enforcement side. That's just not my, forte. So I don't know what he's talking about necessarily there. But what I do know is this, that a city like Chicago, I think what we've forgotten about, and the elites have almost fooled us into forgetting about this, is what we're really talking about, again, at the base level. It's like what I mentioned earlier on sanctuary cities. Who has to deal with it? It's not Rahm Emanuel. It's not the police superintendent. It's the cop on the beat. It's people in poor neighborhoods, generally brown and black people, who have to deal with the on-the-ground reality. Same thing when it comes to schools. Rahm Emanuel is a man who appointed a superintendent of school who is now on her way to prison because she diverted $23 million in taxpayer money, partly to fund her casino visits. That's the level it would be comical if it didn't involve children.
And that's the least of her crimes. And that's the least of the system's crimes. The real crime is stealing children's futures from them.
Of course.
Every generation for the last 5.
Right, of course.
That's the real crime. And the Barbara Byrd Bennett, the petty corruption in the grand scheme of things, $20 million, that's petty corruption in Chicago.
Well, you're right, compared to the grand.
But I mean, that's what everybody focuses on. Oh, and then there's a bad actor, and then she gets jettisoned, and everybody forgets about it. It's the structural imposition of will such that people are dependents, because dependents are reliable votes for the Democrats, and will pay lip service, and I'll tear up every 6 months about a particular kid getting murdered. Or something happening at either CPS school or a god-awful place like Chicago State that's just another boondoggle for patronage. But we don't really want to, we're not defending the system, but we're not going to change it either.
Right.
So if you're not defending it, but you're uninterested really in changing it, what does that say? It says we benefit from it.
Right.
And so that question, I mean, if Trump understands it to that level, and he's run into a lot of grifters in his life, so I think he understands the rackets that are run in places like Chicago and New York, do you get the sense that he's willing to devote political capital which would be not unusual for a president, considering we have an incumbent president who got involved in the state legislative race in Illinois. So he set the standard, did Barack Obama. But Trump to get involved at the state and even the city level politically, to say we need to change out a tiny dancer and the established political order in Chicago for somebody new, and do that in other places too, where you have the kind of urban detritus that has been visited upon Chicago.
I believe so, and not just that I believe so. It's not just my opinion. I've been involved in a lot of conversations with the transition team at Trump Tower in New York, and there's been a lot of pushback that at least as of right now, there's been no Hispanic named to a major post. So they're taking criticism for that, and I think they feel a bit almost besieged because of that. But the conversations that I've had with the Hispanic Advisory Council, with senior members of Trump transition is, while it surely would be nice to have a Hispanic cabinet member, sure, I think it's symbolically important. What's way more important, and this is coming from Trump's senior people, and I think, not that I spoke to him directly, but mainly from Steve Bannon, who's a guy who I implicitly trust and has become sort of a boogeyman for the left,
yes,
incredibly unfairly so, is that what's the most important thing we can do for Hispanics? It's unleash their potential where they live, primarily when it comes to government policy, through education. And that is where they are being largely imprisoned. And by the way, what's real racism? Exactly what you're talking about.
Right.
It's exploiting people for your benefit, for the benefit of a system that exists for your aggrandizement to the detriment of the people you are supposedly serving. And I think the public education system, particularly in inner cities, is that, almost by definition, is that system right now.
And that's why,
but to answer your question, yes, I believe Trump will absolutely devote the political capital necessary to personally get involved on an issue basis and on a political basis in terms of races. In terms of, I don't mean races by ethnicity. I mean
political
races. To intervene, to lend his weight, to say we need to elect free market, free education conservatives in black and brown communities.
And I think he's got to unleash Betsy DeVos, who's an inspired choice for education secretary, amazing school choice reformer in her own right. Unleash her to use the bully pulpit. I mean, education is a local and state issue, but unleash her to use the bully pulpit and some of that budget maybe to drop ship to places like Chicago for scholarships for high-performing, disadvantaged kids. The way that we haven't seen since Bill Bennett was the education secretary, and he would come to Chicago and he would excoriate the system here and call it, as he called it 30 years ago, the Ku Klux Klan could not have designed a better system to keep minority children down than the Chicago public school system. I want to hear that kind of stuff from Trump and Trump's administration because it's true. Right. It was true in the 80s, it was true 20 years before that, and it's true 30 years later. And if we're going to start speaking truth to power, to borrow the left's mantra, the way that Trump has, then let's see that kind of trickle down, if you will, to the states and localities where it's most needed, and this is ground zero for that.
Right. No, and listen, I think it's going to happen. I'll tell you too, part of my conversion, again, as I mentioned, I was very anti-Trump, very vocal about it on air. Part of my conversion was a self-analysis of, I've been supporting and a minor donor to conservatives for a quarter century. And what have they done for me when they go to Washington? They tell me what they want to hear, what I want to hear at a gathering. They do it in policy white papers, but then what do they really do? They go and they generally have sold out to K Street, and they've sold out to a crony system that works for the few and does not at all work for the many, particularly for people of color. And I think Trump has a chance to say enough. And I'll admit that it's a bit of a crazy leap. I'll be the first to admit that. There are risks here to a non-politician, to a complete outsider. But I think that the system is bad enough, the situation is bad enough, that it's worth taking some of those risks. And I personally believe that he has the character and the vision to get this done. And he will risk, he'll risk ostracism in Washington, D.C. He'll risk the adversity of the establishment class, wherever it is, to truly improve the lives of everyday working Americans, whether it's a kid named Jose in Chicago, in inner city Chicago, or whether it's an out-of-work coal miner in Western Pennsylvania.
He is Steve Cortes, Trump campaign surrogate. a member of the Trump Hispanic Advisory Council. You're going to see his mug all over the cable news channels for months and years to come, I'm sure. Steve Cortes, thanks so much for joining us on this edition of Against the Current. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Dan.